I am now going to quickly hand this over to Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar. Heli is, I think, known to pretty much everybody in this room. Heli has been on the cyber diplomatic stage for as long as anybody. She was at NATO. She came out of Estonia. She ran cyber for Estonia, if I could say that, back in the aughts of this century. Then went and spent a good chunk of time leading cyber policy coordination for the European External Action Service, which is, translating that brain, I think, State Department, but it's for the State Department for the European Union. And most recently has gone back to Estonia, been Estonia's cyber ambassador, and now she is director at the Digital Society Institute in Berlin. So she's been all over, she's seen it all. She's seen state-sponsored attacks, if I can say that, from the inside, and so is going to lead us on this "What have we seen in other fields" panel. So thank you very much, Heli, and over to you.
Thank you, Phil. And we are now very glad to present also the cases what we have seen working and not working in other fields. And as we had this secretive meeting already with the panelists last week, and we agreed what we are going to tell you and what we are not going to tell you. So it's my honor to present the panelists. So we will have Mark Lagon from the Global Fund, Lauren Buitta from Girl Security, Jim Thompson from US Department of State, and Michael Daniel, who is also one of us cyber people and currently dealing with CDAC, and of course has had many government and other senior roles before. As we are asked to actually finish this panel 2:30 sharp, we have extremely short time. So the challenge of this panel is to give your wisdom to this audience in shortest but most comprehensible way possible. How have you experienced the successes and failures in the undertakings in non-profit sector, and also rallying the global support for certain causes in your specific path of activities? What has worked, and also very importantly, what has not worked, as we also are supposed to learn from our mistakes. And since we have a very different topics here, so those 7 minutes would, of course, also probably need to cover a bit field that you are in, because we cyber people usually are quite autistic when it comes to other fields of life. So, and for instance, why don't we start with Mark, who has set up the Global Fund on Health Issues. So the 5 billion per year fund to fight HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. This is quite an achievement. And how did you set up the fund? How it was structured? What are those restrictions, lessons learned, failures, successes? Please, floor is yours, Mark.
So I'm Mark Lagon, and I'm actually with the. What's this?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Mark Lagon. I'm actually with Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, TB, and Malaria, which is the NGO that is chief advocate for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which is 21, 22 years old. Its origins came when the Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, realized that the migration from the WHO to UNAIDS was not grappling with the three major infectious disease killers of the early 2000s, AIDS, TB, and malaria. And so the US made the first pledge under the Bush administration a good year before President Bush proposed the bipartisan initiative of PEPFAR. The UN General Assembly offered its own imprimatur, and a trust fund or a financial intermediary fund was set up at the World Bank. The model of the Global Fund is as a bank. It is as a funder to multi-stakeholder groups in country, in low and middle income countries, to fight AIDS or TB or malaria or combinations of those. The multi-stakeholder model has worked in that it exists at two different levels. At the Global Fund's board, which really is determinative of its work, and there at the Global Fund board, which meets twice a year, but is active in governance throughout the year. One has donor countries, implementing countries, low and middle income countries, private sector entities, private foundations, civil society organizations of the South, civil society organizations of the North, and representatives of disease-affected groups, like, for instance, people living with AIDS around the world. The most effective part of the model is the fact that it does not only work with health ministries of national governments, but it insists that any project that it will fund, whether it's prevention of the diseases, detection of the diseases, treatment of the diseases, be proposed in country by a multi-stakeholder group called a Country Coordinating Mechanism, or CCM. And there, the national government, local authorities, civil society actors, even faith-based actors, are involved in making proposals to the Global Fund for funding, which are vetted by the board of the Global Fund for their viability. And that very same multi-stakeholder committee in country is responsible for monitoring, and specific grants are given, like many entities, to a primary recipient and sub-grantees, usually of different sectors. The part of the model that I want to focus on beyond the multi-stakeholderism is resource mobilization. The Global Fund has mobilized an enormous amount of money, and it has had the effect that the Global Fund and partner organizations and countries have been responsible for saving 59 million lives from AIDS, TB, and malaria in the last 22 years. That happens through a replenishment system. So rather than a voluntary annual contribution, like, for instance, the World Food Program benefits from, or dues, or assessments as they're known in the UN, there's a replenishment campaign every 3 years. A host country who makes a bold pledge, typically, and shames, prods, cajoles other nations to make contributions, and not just the G7 donors, but increasingly middle-income countries or countries which have been beneficiaries of funding, putting their own stake in the game. And the burden sharing has been successful because the United States has a provision in law. It is not in the operational procedures of the Global Fund, but a provision in law which incentivizes other donors. It looks like it's onerous, but it's a cap on how much of the Global Fund's budget the United States can fund, 33%. Those of you who are familiar with UN budgets and assessment rates for the United States, that's rather generous. But a ceiling has become a commitment. And the United States pledges boldly, and to date, the Congress has followed through, but other countries know that if they do not match the United States 2-to-1, the pledge money is not going to flow fully. And so there's a strong incentive for other donors to step up. And those have been the major contours. And I'm going to tilt on the side of restraint. But I have comparisons to other fields I'd be happy to share in the future.
Well, thank you. And you were with less than 7 minutes, so it's also remarkable. I think the multi-stakeholderism and this pledge kind of organization is a very interesting way of how you also make sure that others are chipping in. So, and it's a good analogy for us if we go down that road. But let's hear from our other speakers. So, Lauren, you have been setting up the fair housing and this kind of social projects. So how would you see your experiences applicable to our cyber field?
Yeah, I should contextualize my comments. Girl Security is a nonprofit I founded to advance girls and women into national security. But prior to that, I spent a decade managing 2 lawsuits against the city of Chicago for fair housing violations vis-a-vis the False Claims Act. So I became, as lead of research in forensic accounting, I became very intimately familiar with the funding mechanisms of affordable housing, which have been in existence for over a century, as well as some of the failures. And I want to sort of set a disclaimer, which is I'm big on unpacking trauma. I think you get to the good by talking about the bad. So I will be sort of focusing in on affordable housing's pitfalls, but there are really remarkable people and organizations that work on behalf of affordable housing every day. So I don't want my comments, which will be critical, to be a reflection of the people who are working on those issues. And I think the short version of the affordable housing narrative is that what has resulted in affordable housing is really a market failure in the sense that it's created a very concentrated market of private sector developers who, if not for pushback from civil society organizations, would continue to build affordable housing in areas that actually it isn't serving the populations that it's designed to serve. So that's sort of the short form version of it. But the United States had a more formalized approach to affordable housing shortly after the Depression. So that was around the 1930s. And between the 1930s and the 1950s, it continued to develop programs through the Federal Fair Housing Administration, primarily through federal grants. And so as the United States was sort of focused on rebuilding the housing market and providing for affordability post-Depression, other discriminatory practices were also underway, like redlining and blockbusting. And so I think one of the really key takeaways about affordable housing, which is, especially as the federal government or industry, in this case of cyber, is focusing on sort of solving this big problem, it's very easy, if we don't apply an equity lens, to not see some inequitable trends or discriminatory practices that actually can be driven by a lot of the solutions that we're discussing as well. And so around the 70s and 80s as well, you sort of had this influx of federal and state and local government funding. And then again, affordable housing really became about serving low-income communities. So the federal government developed things like low-income housing tax credits, so tax incentives, trust funds, community-based trust funds, which sound sort of similar to what Mark was just discussing, but a space where local affordable housing developers could actually draw down from a collective trust and continue to serve their communities. And in addition, a lot of private sector, PPP, so private sector and public sector partnerships. There were two other services that I was considering as I was thinking about affordable housing, because to me, housing sort of strikes in the same way that cybersecurity does, which is that it is sort of this really basic need that most people understand they need. And I think cyber, at least from our perspective, most people understand what cybersecurity is. It's really a breakdown, I think, between people and industry and talking about it. But water and law enforcement, again, sort of two very different models of funding, both of which benefit from federal, state, and local funding, but also have really unique revenue models. So water user fees or impact fees, and law enforcement through asset seizures, as well as contributions from nonprofit organizations. So I think it's really kind of fascinating. What I think is so cool about what Phil is doing here is deciding what narrative we want to tell about cybersecurity, because that narrative, again, if we aren't thinking about this through a holistic lens, can actually drive some of those worst case outcomes that we've definitely seen happening in affordable housing. So even in this 2023, almost 100 years of affordable housing history, it's continued to fail to meet the goals and intended outcomes that it's had. That's in large part because it's been reacting to the market and driving inequities that have driven a lot of money into the hands of a few and actually not met the needs of the communities it's intending to serve. It's also an area that's just not as heavily prioritized as other areas like national security. And I would say the oversight structure is outmoded. So from what I'm gleaning, there is this discussion about having a strong oversight structure, and I think transparency, almost gross, superfluous transparency, is really critical to ensuring equity and providing for all of these services as well. And I think lack of foresight. We have so much access to data, to an understanding of demographic data, to an understanding of economic trends. I think by leveraging a lot of this sort of foresight that we have access to, we can prevent some of the pitfalls that have happened in other areas like affordable housing. And again, that monopolized market that actually cuts short the services that we all hope will be provided, I think, is probably one of the biggest to avoid.
Thank you. And a lot of money in few hands. This is certainly something that our digital world is characterized by. So, and thank you for this example. So we come back with specific questions later on. But now let's move on to Jim Thompson, who is going to talk about how the governments can incentivize the private sector and stakeholders to contribute to a fund and the Global Equity Fund you set up, please.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. So I've been working at the cross-section of public-private partnerships for the last 20 years. I recognize my colleague Katie that was there sort of at the beginning of this. I have been worked at this at USAID, have been at the State Department for the last 15 years, and have led the federal government in building public-private partnerships from the White House twice. And the reason I mention this is not to brag, but the first time I was there, we did a White House Building Partnerships Best Practices Guide, which I will make sure I get to the organizers so that all of you can get a copy. It is a great document that sort of lays out what public-private partnerships are in the federal government and how we do them. So that we did during the Obama administration. I also went back during the Biden administration, the first year and a half, and put a little bit of imprint on every executive order and every policy that came out. You'll look through them, and even the National Security Strategy and the EO Cyber Strategy all talk about the importance of partnering with the private sector. So this administration believes strongly in that. I do as well. But they didn't ask me to talk to you about those things. They asked me to talk to you today about the Global Equality Fund. So it's very easy. Everyone does this with the Global Equity Fund because it just sounds better. But it's actually a Global Equality Fund. I'll tell you the short story of how it got created and what it is. The story is Hillary Clinton and President Obama, so Secretary Clinton, President Obama, were interested in doing more on LGBTQI plus human rights around the world. Congress gave about $1.5 to $2 million a year for this type of human rights funding. There wasn't a lot of resources going into LGBTQ plus I human rights writ large. And the secretary wanted to do more to support marginalized communities around the world. She believed strongly in this. She came to my office and said, what can we do? And I actually gave her a top 10 list of things that we could do. And the other 9 were really good ideas, but she picked the hardest one, which was, let's start a fund. And it's a huge undertaking to start a fund. But this one was incredibly successful. So again, the State Department only gets $1 or $2 million a year to do human rights programming for the community. But the secretary decided that we would work with other donors. We would reach out to the private sector, foundations, and get them to come on board to provide more support to the human rights defenders out there that are working with this marginalized community. It was an audacious undertaking, but incredibly successful. So to date, they have raised over $132 million for this sector. It is the largest funder for LGBT rights in the world. They have 41 active programs in 80 countries. These countries often do not know that these programs are operating in them. We have brought on 15 countries who write checks to the State Department to do this work. So it's a lot of your OECD donors, but it also has enabled them to contribute into something without having to create something themselves. The State Department manages this program. So it actually takes in the money from the other countries and then puts it through its normal grant-making cycle through our Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau, and we put it out to non-governmental organizations to do this work abroad. We have companies that have joined. They contribute to the fund. We have, I think it's 18 companies now. We just added a couple this in the last couple months. We have companies like the Royal Bank of Canada, so we're not just exclusively American. Deloitte, Hilton, Bloomberg, since we're in this building. Technology companies have come on board as well. And foundations are on board. One of our founding foundations was the Arcus Foundation, which was the largest donor to LGBT rights around the world, and they were only spending a few $1 million a year. And we've included small family foundations and the Mac Aid Foundation. So we have lots of foundations, companies, countries that are supporting this one organization. Partnerships can be done in a number of different ways. This is just one model for you. The majority of what we do at the State Department, I would say, is what we call parallel finance partnerships. So we put money in, the private sector puts money in, and an organization carries out the work. This is a very different model. And it is not completely unique, but it is one that you could explore as a potential for partnerships. And with that, I cede back my time.
Thank you. This idea of parallel funding, I think, was very interesting what you just described, and probably that might work for us, yeah? So now we are moving to Michael Daniel. Michael, so you have extensive background in cyber, and now you're running this help or the assistance program together with other colleagues, whom I also see in the room here, to help Ukraine on cybersecurity. So do you have something from this experience that could be taken as an example for our broader cyber efforts?
Yes, thanks, Heli. So I should actually say that I'm standing in for Greg Rattray, who should actually be here doing this, because he's the real driving force behind the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative. So, you know, any mistakes that I make are mine. Any of the good ideas are actually his in this space, just being clear. But really, you know, this is an adjacent area to cybersecurity. So this is about the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative for Ukraine is about how do you do cyber defense in a hot conflict, right? So not the normal sort of peacetime standard cybersecurity that we've been talking about, but how do you do cybersecurity in the middle, how do you do cyber defense in the middle of a war? And there's many parallels to what we've already been talking about this morning, because a large part of this grew out of, there was a gap, and a whole bunch of people said, hey, we can help with that gap, and so we're going to step into that. So really, what is the gap that I'm talking about? So when you look at like what we typically think of as activities in this space, you've got, particularly in the international area, you've got long-term cyber capacity development. And you know, like Chris Painter is in the office with a Global Fund for Cyber Expertise. We've got a lot of experience, Heli's got a lot of experience in this space of how do you work on building the capacity around the world to do things like good cyber laws? How do you actually, you know, work together with other countries, accede to the Budapest Convention or things like that? On the other end of the spectrum, you've got incident response. So the Russians take down the power grid in, you know, Kyiv for a specific day. How do you actually respond right to that right now? In between those two things are how do you actually better defend the critical infrastructure in Ukraine more generally, not in response to a specific incident, but more generally in this context of an ongoing conflict. And that's really what the CDAC is about. How do you actually help channel and focus all of the desire to provide assistance that came out of the vendor community and get that actually to the people that need it on the ground, right, in Ukraine? So really the CDAC is about facilitating that assistance requests coming out of Ukraine and assistance offers coming from the vendor community that didn't otherwise. Some vendors, some companies had been there for a decade, and they had the local contacts, they had the ability to reach in and provide assistance directly. But a lot of companies don't have that. And so the CDAC was really kind of this facilitating organism that would help make those connections. That's really what it was about. Over time, of course, as with many of these things, you start to realize that you need some structure, right, to help with these kinds of activities. So eventually, the CDAC becomes a project underneath CRDF Global, which is a long-standing nonprofit in the international security space. Actually came out of the nuclear, nuclear nonproliferation, denuclearization of the Soviet Union and post-Soviet states. So the kinds of activities that you can think of that CDAC is doing are things like, so there's a project called Voithia, which is where CTA is heavily involved with, which is the provision of cyber threat intelligence to network defenders in Ukraine. So how do you actually get them IOCs, other kinds of technical cyber threat intelligence that they can use to help better defend their networks? And how do you do that at a speed that anybody actually cares about, right? There's also things like, how do we actually help the main gas company in Ukraine, Naftogaz, actually build a real security operations center and have it really do what it needs to do to protect that critical infrastructure? So those are the kinds of projects that we're talking about, sort of, again, sitting in this middle space. Some of the limitations, though, that you see are common to what we've been talking about in the broader context of this workshop so far. So things like, okay, when all of this got started, we didn't really know how long the war is going to last. Okay, we're at 2 years and counting, right? No end in sight. How long can some of these vendors do this effectively pro bono? How long can we continue to devote, a lot of hours and time and effort to supporting this project without any additional outside resources? But there's a problem. And I can say this particularly wearing my old OMB hat from the US government. There's no bucket that says cyber defense anywhere in any agency, right? There's no funding source in the US government. So you kind of have to squint and twist around and, work on, maybe we can get some funding to come from this direction, but that takes a long time. So starting now, we probably could work on something that might show up like in 2 years, right? So that's a long time. There's, other limitations that the companies face too. There's a risk inherent in this space, right? You're operating in a conflict zone. So how much of a target do you become by operating in this conflict zone? Do you become a combatant? At what point do you become no longer a civilian that is protected by the laws of war, but you are now effectively a combatant in this space and are a legitimate target of the Russian government, right? Where is that line? Nobody really knows. Like, we're talking about that, but that's, and some companies, I will say, some companies in this space have a much greater risk tolerance than others. And so that varies wildly across the range of participants. How do you balance providing what the defenders already know how to use, right? Because they're very familiar with it and they're in a combat situation, they need to be able to use it really quickly, but it's probably not really the best or the latest tool that's out there, right? And in fact, what they've actually been using is probably no longer supported by the vendor. Maybe the vendor that originally made it's gone out of business. So how do you actually balance between, yeah, they got to know how to use something and they can't spend a whole lot of time learning how to use it in the middle of a war, versus you actually got to get them the thing that actually works, right? How do you balance those two things? So some of the other challenges that we've had in this space has been actually even figuring out what the requirements are. How do you actually get people to articulate their requirements? Turns out that's really hard. It's even harder to get it done in a fashion that you can figure out then how to actually match up and coordinate through this mechanism. So those are some of the things that that we've seen, that we've learned, as we've been going through this process, and we're still, really learning. But I'll say a couple of things to just connect to the broader conversation. A lot of what you've heard up here on this panel, I would argue, is about policy choices. And that one of the things that we're actually talking about in this space that I think we should hit square on is that we often mistake policy decisions and the implications of policy decisions for immutable laws of nature. And that if we think about housing, we have a housing shortage in this country, not because of some law of nature that says that there's a finite amount of housing. It's because we've chosen that as a policy matter. We have chosen our policies that result in that. We've chosen policies in these other spaces that have allowed us to do more and to do other things. And so I would submit that we're in a similar space here with a lot of what we're talking about in cybersecurity is about what policy choices do we want to make that actually affect all of the options that affect everybody in this room. and that there are a lot of things that are not, in fact, immutable laws of nature. They may be hard. They may actually gore someone's ox. And to Jay's point, who pays for this? But they are not immutable laws of nature that we cannot change. So with that, I will turn it back over to Heli.
Thank you, Michael. And you are very much right. It is about policy choices. And I think we, the cyber people, really need to get it right after all this agonizing over 10, 15 years, how our file is not anywhere, in the financing and how the development assistance doesn't cover cyber, or how you cannot actually convince the US government that Ukraine cyber defense is as important as the tanks and airplanes. Yes, it is right. And it's time that we are not anymore up and coming field, but already established field. So that's why we are here in this room. So I just wanted to ask all of you one question. I think all the cases you described are the public good, common good type of undertakings where you have to convince both the governments and the private sector to equally provide the contributions. Governments, interestingly, in your cases, probably are more forward-coming because everybody understands, yes, AIDS is bad, malaria is bad, or we really need housing for the people. In our case, it's not so sure that governments also understand what we talk about. And also what is interesting in our case, maybe it's close to this housing situation, that there is a number of companies that have benefited a lot from very nicely functioning interoperable internet. But the companies are there as well struggling with cybersecurity and cannot afford it. So do you have any good kind of advice for us how to bridge this kind of public and private thinking, or how you bring those stakeholders to a common understanding in your specific fields? And of course, Michael can then answer the question for all of us on cyber field. But yeah,
if I
please.
can just chime in. I think most issues rise to a public good status when more people care about them. And I think the public, catalyzing the public as a social movement in elevating this issue is a missed opportunity that we keep missing over and over again. And I know it from my national security background, and I know it from work on equity and affordable housing, is that we have to catalyze the public as a social movement to be a driver of support for all of these other issues.
Yeah, Mark.
A couple of things I would raise from the Global Fund model to answer your question. One, I pick out exactly on what you're saying, but we speak of public-private partnerships, but the multi-stakeholderism at both the board level and in-country level for the work of the Global Fund, it's very importantly a public-private civic partnership. And while the resources often come from the public and private partners, in the case of the Global Fund, the knowledge of communities, the ability to reach people, ethical dimensions are provided by civil society. Secondly, yes, there needs to be political will in the case of cyber, which may have existed in some of our examples more strongly. But one of the biggest drivers of Global Fund's success has been guaranteeing demand for the private sector, pooled procurement. I mean, think of early in the era of the global battle against AIDS, the discussion of intellectual property for pharma companies, and whether antiretroviral drugs being wondrous, that people could live a lifetime with AIDS and no longer be a death sentence. But if it was absolutely unaffordable based on a structure of you have to have high prices so that you can pay for your later research on other products, the Global Fund, by guaranteeing high demand, whether it's for drugs or diagnostic equipment or what have you, incentivizes a lowering of prices. And that revolutionized things in the Global South for affordable, life-saving care.
Yeah, thank you. Jim?
I would just say it's important to get people together at the outset and brainstorm with them. If you can co-create with people, they see themselves as part of the solution. So sitting down with not just cyber companies, not just the IT companies, but you look at the gas lines, the pipeline companies, and how they were affected by cyber, or our airlines and the risks inherent. Even our one-day self-driving cars, could easily be hacked. There's a universe of people that would be interested in increasing cybersecurity, and they all need to be at the table. So creating conferences like this, opportunities to talk, for people to bring something to the table. That co-creation process is really key in building good, strong public-private partnerships. And then when they are established, like this Global Equality Fund has been around now for over 10 years, keeping them engaged, making them part of the process, keeping them going. So in this Global Equality Fund, we not only have over 132 million, we actually have active partners who participate in our award process. They sit on our panels, going through the proposals that have come through from the NGOs. And this is other countries, this is donors from the private sector. They're participants in the whole program. So all of those factors make public-private partnerships successful.
Michael?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add also is that a lot of the factors, a lot of the way that we talk about cybersecurity as if it were something so completely different from all the other fields. And the truth is that it actually shares many of the same characteristics that a lot of other issues have. And so if you think about the way that we actually need to engage, right, the medical field can have a lot of really complex terminology, a lot of technical terminology. You have a lot of professionalism and expertise that you need, but at the end of the day, you also still have to communicate with patients and speak to them in a language that they can actually understand. And so there are lessons that we can learn by being more interdisciplinary in the cybersecurity field, and releasing some of our special snowflakeness to engage and actually admit that we can learn lessons from other areas.
Yeah, thank you. And probably if I now try to wrap up and maybe add one thought that I had been thinking some time is that why don't we also look at cyber like public safety issue? Because when you sell something to the policymakers as a public safety issue, you take it out from the more technical kind of defense, security, military corner. So safety is almost like malaria, right? So it can, virus is bad for all of us, in human virus, in computer. And probably that's the way to go to convince the policymakers. And this was the advice from you, Lauren, that we have to make it a major case and make sure that everybody understands the urgency. Also, how we keep up the interest by the contributing partners. I think this is good advice from Mark, how this has been done in this field. And the parallel kind of track and co-creation of the common interest. I think these are also very good pieces of advice. And certainly we have seen already some of the interesting NGO and non-profit work going on in this field. Probably there are models in our cyber field where we can also scale up. And governments are moving into this space. So, Michael, we are working with the OECD, some governments are working to make the case that cyber should be part of the ODA fundable development assistance funding in order to help the less developed nations when it comes to the government side. But here we also talk about our own small enterprises, small organizations, and the different parts of our own society who cannot afford cyber. And this is another maybe product that the Global Cyber Alliance is offering, the free tools for our smaller organizations and smaller businesses in Europe, in the United States, everywhere, to keep their business going. This is also the problem. So there are many parts of our society who are right now vulnerable in this field. And certainly the solution should be found. And thank you. I think we have no time. You want to add something, Mark, please?
I'd just like to, I used to be the U.S. Ambassador at Large to Combat Human Trafficking and CEO of Polaris, an anti-trafficking NGO. And if you look at the comparison of the Global Fund to something created in 2017 by legislation, a Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, it drives home some of the things. One is framing. You were talking about safety. to call human trafficking a jargon term, modern slavery mobilized political will. However, the desire for burden sharing and the US putting in maybe 25% of the resources and mobilizing others didn't work because there wasn't actually a mechanism that incentivized the other donors like US law does for the Global Fund. And then finally, and this is a place where I would say cyber would be in a good position, there was the idea that this Global Fund to End Modern Slavery would have data, incidence reports, to know how you were improving in countries if you have a compact with the government of a country. And it took at least 2 or 3 years in the life of that Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, or GFEMS, to even have those incidence reports. So leveraging data to prove the extent of the problem and to show that interventions are working, absolutely essential to sustain political will.
Thank you. Thank you. And let's make applause.